Making a good horror movie is hard. Making a good horror sequel is nearly impossible. You have to recapture what made the original special while adding something new, and if you lean too far in either direction, you end up with a movie that either feels like a carbon copy or something that has nothing to do with the franchise it claims to belong to. Most horror sequels fail, that's just the reality. But every once in a while, a sequel comes along that not only lives up to the original, but actually surpasses it. I went through every major horror sequel, separated the masterpieces from the disasters, and ranked them all on a tier list. Some of these placements are going to make you very happy, others are going to make you want to throw your phone. Let's get into it. Starting in F tier, the absolute bottom, the sequels that should have never been made. And there is no better place to start than Jaws: The Revenge. This movie's entire premise is that the shark is personally targeting the Brody family, not a shark, the shark. As in it somehow knows who the Brodys are, holds a grudge, and followed them from New York to the Bahamas to get revenge. This is a fish with a vendetta and a functioning GPS system. The movie ends with Ellen Brody stabbing the shark with a boat and the shark explodes. It just explodes. No bomb, no explanation. It just detonates on contact like a great white piñata. Jaws. The Revenge killed a franchise that was already on life support and buried it so deep that nobody has seriously attempted a theatrical Jaws sequel since. Michael Caine was in this movie, and when asked about it, he said he never saw it, but by all accounts it was terrible. However, he had seen the house it built, and that was terrific. Respect. Staying in F tier, we have Exorcist II: The Heretic. The original Exorcist is arguably the greatest horror film ever made. It's a masterpiece of atmosphere, performance, and genuine terror. So naturally, the sequel decided to ignore everything that worked and replace it with psychic locusts, a hypnosis machine, and Richard Burton looking confused in Africa. This movie takes the deeply personal story of a mother trying to save her daughter from demonic possession and turns it into a globe-trotting supernatural adventure that makes absolutely no sense. Linda Blair returned for this sequel, and even she couldn't save it. The original director, William Friedkin, reportedly walked out of the theater during a test screening. When the guy who made the first movie can't sit through the second one, you know something went catastrophically wrong. Exorcist 2 didn't just disappoint audiences, it actively insulted them. Book of Shadows: Blair Witch 2 rounds out F tier. The original Blair Witch Project was a cultural phenomenon. Made for $60,000, it grossed nearly $250 million and pioneered the found footage genre. The sequel had every opportunity to build on that foundation. Instead, it abandoned the found footage format entirely, cast a group of forgettable characters on a tour of the Blair Witch locations, and delivered a generic supernatural thriller that could have been any straight-to-DVD horror movie from the early 2000s. It kept nothing that made the original special. No found footage, no ambiguity, no slow-building dread. Just jump scares and bad dialogue in a movie that clearly existed for no reason other than to cash in on a brand name, while that brand name still meant something. It didn't for long after this. Moving into D tier, sequels that aren't unwatchable but clearly missed the mark. Halloween Resurrection is the textbook D tier horror sequel. It takes Michael Myers, one of the most iconic villains in cinema, and puts him in a reality TV show. Busta Rhymes karate chops Michael Myers in this movie. That is a real thing that happens. The film opens by killing off Laurie Strode, the heart and soul of the franchise, in the first 10 minutes just so it can pivot to a cast of reality show contestants being hunted in the Myers house while cameras stream the footage online. It took everything that made Halloween iconic and reduced it to a gimmick. The film was so poorly received that it effectively killed the original timeline and forced the franchise into a full reboot. Saw 3D also lands in D tier. By this point, the Saw franchise had been releasing a new movie every single October for 7 consecutive years, and the fatigue was showing. The traps, which were once the centerpiece of the franchise, had become so elaborate and so removed from Jigsaw's original philosophy that they stopped feeling meaningful. Jigsaw tested people because he believed they didn't value their lives. By Saw 3D, the traps were just killing people in increasingly creative ways with no deeper purpose. The 3D gimmick didn't help. Watching a guy's intestines fly toward the camera in 3 dimensions is exactly as tasteless as it sounds. The franchise needed a break, and Saw 3D was the movie that finally proved it. Paranormal Activity 4 closes out D tier. The first Paranormal Activity was a masterclass in slow burn tension, a static camera, a bedroom door, and subtle details that escalated night after night. By the fourth installment, the formula had been stretched so thin that the scares felt mechanical. You could practically set a timer for when the next loud noise was going to hit. The mythology had expanded beyond what the found footage format could support, and the characters were so forgettable that you couldn't remember their names 5 minutes after the credits rolled. Paranormal Activity 4 proved that even the most effective horror gimmick has a shelf life, and this franchise had passed its expiration date 2 movies ago. C tier is where we find sequels that are perfectly watchable but don't do anything exceptional. They exist, they entertain for 90 minutes, and then you forget about them within a week. Friday the 13th. Part 6. Jason Lives actually deserves some credit for being the first movie in the franchise to lean fully into self-awareness. It opens with Jason being resurrected by a lightning bolt like Frankenstein's monster, and from that point forward it embraces its own absurdity. There are actual comedic beats written into the script, and Tommy Jarvis is a legitimately compelling final boy. But at the end of the day, it's still a Friday the 13th movie, which means 20 minutes of setup, followed by an hour of Jason walking through a campground collecting bodies. It's fun, it's not essential. The Conjuring 2 sits in C tier, and I know that's gonna bother some people. The Enfield case is a fascinating real-world story, and James Wan directs the hell out of it. The Crooked Man sequence is genuinely terrifying, but the movie doesn't hit the same way the original does. The first Conjuring felt like a slow descent into something inescapable. The sequel feels more like a series of set pieces connected by a plot that doesn't quite hold together. Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson are excellent as always, but the scares feel more manufactured than earned. It's a good horror movie, it's just not a great sequel to a great horror movie, and that distinction matters on a tier list. Insidious Chapter 2 also lives in C tier. It picks up immediately after the first film's cliffhanger, which is a bold structural choice. The problem is that the first Insidious worked because of its restraint. The scares were built through atmosphere and suggestion. The sequel goes bigger and louder, which dilutes the tension. There are still effective moments, and the way it connects back to the original through time travel is genuinely clever, but it lost the quiet dread that made the first film special, and that trade-off keeps it from climbing higher. B tier is where things get interesting. These are sequels that genuinely deliver and in some cases come dangerously close to matching the original. Halloween H20 is a satisfying return for Laurie Strode. 20 years after the original, Jamie Lee Curtis came back and delivered a performance that reminded everyone why she's the ultimate final girl. The film strips away the bloated mythology that the franchise had accumulated and refocuses on the simple premise of Laurie versus Michael. The final act, where Laurie stops running and decides to hunt Michael instead, is one of the most cathartic moments in the entire franchise. It's not as good as the 1978 original, but it's the best sequel, the original timeline, produced by a significant margin. Scream 2 belongs in B tier because it does something that very few horror sequels even attempt. It comments on the idea of horror sequels while being a horror sequel. The movie literally has a film class discussion about whether sequels can ever be as good as the original, and then it proceeds to almost prove its own point. The opening scene in the movie theater is one of the most effective sequences in the franchise. The mystery of who Ghostface is this time around is well constructed, and the meta commentary never feels forced because it's genuinely integrated into the story. The only thing holding it back is that the Scream formula is inherently less surprising the second time around. You know there will be a reveal. You know someone close to Sydney is the killer. That predictability keeps it from reaching the heights of the original, but it's still one of the smartest horror sequels ever made. Final Destination 2 might actually be more entertaining than the original. The opening highway pileup is the single most intense scene in the entire franchise, and a strong argument can be made that it's the best opening in any horror sequel period. The kills are more elaborate, more creative, and more suspenseful than the first film. That scene in the elevator with the prosthetic hook, or the kid who almost gets crushed by a plate of glass, these are sequences that make you physically tense in your seat. The franchise formula of death hunting down survivors in elaborate Rube Goldberg chains hit its peak in this movie. It's the rare sequel that understood exactly what audiences wanted and delivered it without hesitation. The reason it stays in B tier instead instead of climbing higher is that it doesn't add anything meaningful beyond bigger and better death scenes. It's a refinement, not an evolution. But what a refinement it is. The Conjuring spin-off, Annabelle creation, also earns B tier. This is a prequel technically, but it functions as a sequel to the first Annabelle, which was mediocre at best. Annabelle creation is the movie the first one should have been. It's atmospheric, patient, and features some genuinely frightening sequences involving the doll and the demon attached to it. The farmhouse setting is used brilliantly, and the child actors deliver performances that make the scares land harder because you actually care about the characters in danger. This is a case where a sequel course-corrected so effectively that it essentially erased the problems of its predecessor. A tier is reserved for sequels that don't just live up to the original, they redefine the franchise. Scream 6 earns its spot here by doing something no other Scream sequel fully committed to. It moved the setting out of Woodsboro and into New York City, which shouldn't work, but absolutely does. The bodega scene is one of the most brutal ghost face attacks in the franchise. The subway sequence is genuinely nerve-wracking, and the film carries an aggression that previous entries didn't have, with a ghost face that's physically more dominant and violent than any version that came before. The new core 4 characters have fully come into their own, and the franchise feels revitalized in a way that earns comparisons to the original. Scream 6 proved that Scream can survive without Sidney Prescott as the lead, which is an achievement that seemed impossible before this movie existed. Wes Craven's New Nightmare deserves a tier for being years ahead of its time. Before Scream, before the entire meta-horror movement, New Nightmare asked the question, what if Freddy Krueger was real and was haunting the actual actress who played Nancy in the original film? Heather Langenkamp plays herself, Robert Englund plays himself, and Wes Craven plays himself in a movie about the making of a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel where the fictional villain is crossing into reality. It was 1994, and most audiences weren't ready for it, which is why it underperformed commercially. But looking back now, New Nightmare is one of the most innovative horror films of its decade. It deconstructed the franchise before deconstruction was even a recognized approach in horror, and it did it with intelligence and genuine scares. This movie laid the groundwork for everything Wes Craven would perfect 2 years later with Scream. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 3 Dream Warriors also sits comfortably in A tier. This is the sequel that perfected the Freddy formula. The original was a masterpiece of atmosphere and dread. Dream Warriors kept that foundation, but added something new. The idea that the kids could develop superpowers within their dreams and fight back against Freddy was brilliant, because it raised the stakes in both directions. Freddy was more creative and more dangerous than ever, but the victims now had weapons of their own. The kills are iconic. The puppet scene where Freddy uses a kid's veins as marionette strings is still one of the most disturbing images in franchise history, and the ensemble cast of teenage patients at a psychiatric hospital gives the film an emotional core that most slashers don't bother with. Dream Warriors is the gold standard for how to make a horror sequel that expands the mythology without betraying the original vision. And now S tier, the sequels so good that they stand alongside or above the originals. These are the rare cases where lightning struck twice. Scream brought self-awareness to horror. The original is a masterpiece, but the 2022 legacy sequel, also titled Scream, belongs in S tier because it managed to do the impossible. It introduced a new generation of characters while honoring the original cast, delivered a mystery that was genuinely surprising, and used its meta commentary to say something meaningful about toxic fandom and the relationship between audiences and the franchises they love. The opening scene with Tara is a perfect update of the Drew Barrymore sequence from 1996, and the final act brings the story full circle in a way that feels earned rather than manufactured. This is how you continue a legacy franchise without destroying what made it special. Alien sits in S tier because James Cameron took one of the greatest horror films ever made and turned it into one of the greatest action films ever made, and somehow it works as both. The original Alien was about isolation, vulnerability, and a single creature picking off a helpless crew. Aliens is about a platoon of heavily armed Marines being systematically dismantled by hundreds of xenomorphs, and despite the firepower difference, the humans are just as helpless. Ripley's arc from survivor to warrior is one of the greatest character progressions in film history. The power loader fight against the Queen is iconic, and the line "get away from her, you bitch" is the single most satisfying moment in any horror franchise. Aliens proved that a sequel can completely change genre and still honor everything the original built. That takes a level of filmmaking confidence that most directors don't have. But the #1 spot, the single greatest horror sequel ever made, belongs to The Bride of Frankenstein. Before Aliens, before Scream, before any modern franchise even existed, James Whale took his 1931 classic and made something even more extraordinary. The Bride of Frankenstein is deeper, funnier, more emotional, and more thematically ambitious than the original. Boris Karloff's performance as the monster is heartbreaking. The scene where the monster learns to speak and experiences friendship for the first time before having it ripped away is one of the most moving sequences in horror history. And the bride herself, despite being on screen for only a few minutes, created an image so powerful that it's been referenced in every decade since. The film explores themes of creation, rejection, loneliness, and the cruelty of playing God, all wrapped in a gothic horror package that was decades ahead of its time. It was made in 1935, and it's still better than 99% of horror sequels made since. The Bride of Frankenstein is proof that the very first horror franchise understood something that most modern franchises still haven't figured out. A sequel isn't supposed to repeat the original, it's supposed to complete it. That's every major horror sequel ranked from franchise killer to masterpiece. If you think I missed one or ranked something too high or too low, the comments are right there and I know you have opinions. Tell me the sequel you think deserved S tier that I left out, and I'll tell you why you're wrong. Subscribe because the next video in this series is already written and it might be the most controversial one yet.